Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Welcome to Independent Women's Forum's podcast. Today, we will be discussing the new Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch, and last night's great television, the decision made by President Trump on this decision. With me today, my name is Ashley Carter, and I am the Director of Coalitions for the Independent Women's Forum, where I work to establish relationships with the Independent Women's Forum and like-minded organizations to help promote the issues that IWF works on. With me today, I have Erin Hawley, who is the Senior Legal Fellow for Independent Women's Forum. Erin Hawley is an associate professor at the University of Missouri, where she teaches constitutional litigation, federal income tax, tax policy, and agricultural law. Her scholarship focuses primarily on the federal courts, and she has been published in numerous top journals. Prior to joining the law school, she practiced at King & Spalding, Kirkland & Ellis, and has worked at the Department of Justice as counsel to Attorney General Michael Mukasey. Professor Hawley is also a former clerk to Chief Justice John Roberts of the Supreme Court of the United States and Judge Wilkinson of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. Professor Hawley has litigated extensively before the Supreme Court of the United States, as well as has numerous federal courts of appeals and state courts of last resort. She's twice argued before the D.C. Court of Appeals and also represented the United States in oral argument before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. Professor Hawley continues to litigate, and her work has been widely quoted, including by the Washington Post and U.S. News. Professor Hawley received her bachelor's degree at Texas A&M University and her law degree at Yale Law School. Today, I welcome Erin Hawley for her to discuss our new Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch. Welcome, Erin. How are you?
Doing great, Ashley. Thanks so much for having me.
You, I'm sure, like myself, we were very intently watching last night's decision on television, and it was a nail-biting leading up to it yesterday. I know there were several great candidates who were up for the position, Bill Pryor, Thomas Hardiman, and ultimately the president selected Neil Gorsuch, who is a fantastic judge. Can you tell me a little bit about his background and how he got to where he is today?
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, Ashley, Judge Gorsuch is an absolutely fantastic pick for the Supreme Court vacancy. And it's important to remember here that the vacancy that is being filled is the late Justice Scalia's. And of course, Justice Scalia is irreplaceable. He really changed the way that lawyers and judges and the American people think about law. He taught us and sort of ingrained in our culture that the text is important. So we need to look at what the founders said in the Constitution. And one reason I believe that Judge Gorsuch is such a good pick is that he also believes that judges should interpret the law rather than make it. He's a judge very much in the mold of Justice Scalia. And I think for this reason in particular, he's a fabulous pick. As far as his background, the judge grew up in Colorado and chose to raise his family there as well. He's an avid outdoorsman and fisherman. They have horses at their small barn and do the sorts of things that ordinary Americans do. He had some jobs growing up that many of us did. He worked at a hotel, for example, and then he attended school at Columbia University, went to Harvard Law School, and then was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford. So an impeccably credentialed man who also has the sort of real-world experience that we can relate to as people here in America.
Yes, and you know what I found very interesting is that he's very young, only 49, And I also, when learning a little bit more about him, I found out that he is an avid skier, which I find so interesting. He'll probably be the best skier of the 9 justices.
No doubt on that score.
So, looking at this, we see that he is a very solid conservative pick. This is something that President Trump said in his campaign promises that he would definitely make a solid Supreme Court pick for this position. Do you foresee any problems with the confirmation of this nominee, and what might that process look like moving forward?
I really don't see any problems with the confirmation process, Ashley. And you never know, politics being what they are, but the facts here are really good. Judge Gorsuch is, of course, a very well-respected judge, impeccably credentialed judge, and when he was nominated to the 10th Circuit, he was approved by a voice vote, which means that the senators didn't even want to sort of register their dissent if they disagreed with his appointment. So really sort of in a unanimous appointment to the 10th Circuit. And several prominent Democrat senators were on or part of the Senate at that time, including Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. So these individuals have already voted at once for him, or at least allowed a voice vote to go forward. So I think everyone recognizes that he's highly credentialed, and he has served incredibly well as a 10th Circuit judge. Now, the Supreme Court is, of course, higher stakes, so we may see more hand-wringing or dissent. You asked a little bit about the process, and the process is actually quite involved. So beginning in 1955 is when confirmation hearings really first got going. Before that, there was not this sort of kabuki dance where senators ask all sorts of questions and the nominee tries not to answer, which is kind of what our confirmation hearings look like today. But the process begins with about a 100-page questionnaire that the Senate Judiciary Committee sends to the nominee, and then the nominee basically sends them every piece of paperwork that they've ever worked on. So if he was in the Justice Department, the committee will get his Justice Department memos. They will get all of his opinions, of course. They'll get any law review articles or legal articles, news articles that he has written. And the committee and those helping Judge Gorsuch will comb through that extensive record to sort of see what kind of justice he will be. So an extensive record in his case to look through. Then the actual confirmation hearings will start, where Senate Judiciary Committee members will ask questions, usually for several days, of the nominee. And then following that, the Senate Judiciary Committee will vote him out of committee, presumably, and then the entire Senate will have an opportunity to vote on his confirmation.
Fantastic. And as you said, we hopefully will not foresee any problems. This should be a smooth confirmation process. Although I did hear that you mentioned Chuck Schumer. He has already mentioned today that he does not like some of Judge Gorsuch's prior opinions on issues such as siding with corporations and women's rights. But we hope to foresee a simple 2/3 majority, a very easy confirmation process. And Judge Gorsuch will become our next justice. Looking at some of the cases that are presented this year that the court will decide, we have issues concerning trademark rights with the Washington Redskins, school choice options, transgender bathroom rights. What do you think some of the potential outcomes could be for the cases this year with Gorsuch on the bench?
Well, it's always difficult to predict, Ashley, how a particular judge or justice will rule in a particular case. Those cases have not been briefed yet for large parts to the court, so there's a bunch of legal questions that are up in the air. But I think the important thing, again, is how Judge Gorsuch, hopefully Justice Gorsuch, will approach those questions. And again, it will be much in line with what Justice Scalia would have done. He will look at the text of the statute rather than sort of what he thinks the law should be. and that will keep him constrained. And as a justice, he will be faithful to the text and Constitution. You'd mentioned specifically the transgender cases, obviously a really hot button sort of civil rights case of our era. But in that case, there's actually a second question about the process that the executive department used to issue this letter of guidance. And there's very real questions about whether that was the appropriate procedure to go through. And Justice Gorsuch is very much in the camp of Justice Scalia, being serious about the separation of powers. And some powers reside with the president, some powers reside with Congress, and other powers reside with the judiciary. So I could see him, for example, deciding that transgender mandate was inappropriately issued. But again, it's hard to predict specific results of specific cases, but very confident in the approach he would bring to each case he considers.
Fantastic. And not just looking at this year, but, as a Supreme Court justice, you sit for life or until you decide to retire. And moving forward, what are some of the other issues that could confront the Supreme Court and that a solidly conservative justice could change?
Oh, goodness, Ashley, there's a ton of decisions. As you know, the Supreme Court weighs in on most of the pressing issues of our time now. And there's, of course, the issue of abortion, and there's the issue of end-of-life decisions. There's issues involving unions and free speech. There'll be campaign limits that come before the court. There'll also be really pressing issues of religious liberty, which Judge Gorsuch has already said a lot about. One interesting thing, though, to note is that the confirmation of Judge Gorsuch wouldn't actually change the balance of the court. Since Justice Scalia was a decidedly conservative member of the court, a solid vote in that camp, with a few exceptions on the Fourth Amendment and such, but generally what would be considered a conservative justice, then Judge Gorsuch really won't be changing the balance so much as important as providing that all important fifth vote in some of these cases.
And I noticed while doing some research that Judge Gorsuch had clerked for one of the standing Supreme Court justices in his time. He clerked for Justice Kennedy. Now, this is not unprecedented. Other Supreme Court justices have clerked for in the past. But what, if anything, could this mean for the new Supreme Court? It is an interesting little tidbit that our listeners could take away with. How could you see this playing out as Gorsuch being someone who has looked up to Justice Kennedy?
I think it's actually a great fact, Ashley, and the reason being that the judges are often proud of their clerks, which is very nice. And so Justice Kennedy will, I'm sure, be proud that his former clerk is now a nominee and very likely will join him on the Supreme Court as another justice. So it's kind of a wonderful legacy to have while you are still alive to enjoy it. So I imagine, I don't know personally, but imagine they will have a rapport that Justice Gorsuch, if he becomes that, will hopefully be able to talk to and influence Justice Kennedy on key decisions. And it's also interesting to note, Ashley, that kind of providentially, Judge Gorsuch initially signed on to clerk for Justice White. And Justice White was also from Colorado. And there's traditionally been sort of a quote-unquote Western seat that has been absent since Justice White retired. And now this would, if Judge Gorsuch is confirmed, we will again have a judge from the West, which would be quite nice.
Very interesting. And, obviously, we're talking about how these nominees have clerked for past justices or sitting justices, and you yourself clerked for Justice John Roberts President Trump has 4 years and potentially several more Supreme Court picks. Could this mean that we're going to see a Justice Aaron Hawley down the road?
Oh, goodness. Well, I very much hope that President Trump has several more picks and picks judges very much in the line with Judge Gorsuch. So very delighted to see that possibility, and just looking forward to see who the president hopefully nominates for those seats. And first focusing on confirming Judge Gorsuch, of course.
Fantastic. Well, there you have it. Thank you, Erin, so much for taking time out of your day today. You're a fantastic lawyer, professor, as you might have, our listeners may have heard, as well as mother. You really are spectacular in both your legal perspective and working for IWF. I appreciate the time that you've given to us for our podcast today, and hope you can continue to apprise us of the nomination and what Judge Gorsuch plans to complete down his road as Supreme Court Justice.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ashley, for having me. It's really an exciting time.
Thank you. Listeners, if you're interested in listening to more of our podcasts, you can find us at iwf.org. On the web, iwf.org. Thank you for having us today and listening in. I hope you can hear us on our next podcast. This has been a podcast of the Independent Women's Forum.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by iwf.org for similar content.